Hi, I'm FIDE Master Livy Cherbulenko, and in this series I explore the typical mistakes of people rated anywhere between 1000 and 2000. This is a first reaction, no engine analysis, of a chess at hand gameplay between 1913 versus 1331. Let's start. Let's see. So it was e4, c6, black plays the Caro-Kann, g6, okay, so you see that he delays. Normally we go c6, d5, this is called the Caro-Kann defense, and black basically wants to fight for the center, wants to pressure white's central pawn. That would be a normal continuation, but black chose g6 instead, which is interesting. Alright, knight c3. Another move would be pawn d4. Usually in chess we first want to push the pawns in the center and then develop the minor pieces like the knight, the bishop, and the castle. But the rule of thumb is you usually develop the pawns and then the pieces. But okay, knight c3 is fine, bishop g7, alright, d4, white has a nice pawn center, true developed knights, is fine. Knight f6, yeah, not so sure about knight f6, because now I can play like e5, so not so sure about it. I think another move would have been maybe like d5, fighting for the center, or maybe d6, preventing e5 and then knight f6. Because then if knight f6, e5, black can just take, and then if d, black takes the queen. So then white doesn't really have any attack if the queens get exchanged. So it's very good for black to trade the queens in case of e5, right? But yeah, to play knight f6 immediately, I think that's a mistake, or at least an inaccuracy, because white can just play e5 with tempo, and the e5 pawn will not get challenged. But okay, let's see. So bishop d3, way too passive. I think e5 was a move, and after, if a knight goes back, that's just bad. Knight h5 just loses to g4, have a nice trap. Knight g4, also not ideal. The knight is loose, and white can at the very least just play like h3, and then knight h6, the knight goes to a corner, and then even f5 is not stable because of g4, so that's just a bad knight. Maybe white can even like go knight g5 and attack the knight, attack f7. This is clearly bad, so knight d5 would be the move, but white can just like take, and now white has a very neat pawn structure. Black has double pawns, king is in the center, bad bishop, all black's pieces are undeveloped. White can play like c3, strengthening, the pawn chain. There's also this pawn hook, which is g6, so white can play like h4, h5, and then depending on the situation, white can either take and activate his rook on the h file, or he can push the pawn further and like make the bishop go back to f8, gain space, and black has very weak dark square, so white here has a clear advantage. So that's why I think yeah, like white could even like start with h4 with initiative. I think white should have played e5. So when your opponent, doesn't prevent e5, don't like play passive moves or like autopilot moves. You should punish your opponent. If your opponent does not make the correct moves, you should make the most aggressive move. You should always make the most aggressive moves and not like just autopilot developing moves. Okay, so bishop d3 I think is inaccurate. Okay, castles. Again, I think he should play d6. Because then in case of e5, at least black can like challenge once the e5 pawn, right? So for example, here, if a pawn is not on d6 and white plays e5, the pawn is unchallenged. Versus here, black takes, white takes. Now already this e5 pawn does not have the support of another pawn, of a pawn on d4, right? So it's weaker, plus black, opens up his queen. The game becomes more open, which means black might have some piece counterplay. Versus when the game is closed, black doesn't have enough scope for his pieces to create counterplay, right? That's why it's so strong for white. So black should play d6. But okay, castles. Again, white, okay, why just castles? It's fine, but this would have been quite interesting. e5, and again, let's say if knight d5, we can just take, and now simply h4, right? Typical idea. We use the fact that we have not castled yet, right? And we will activate our rook without having moved it as a point. Or depending on the situation, like I said earlier, we might even push it to h6, gain more space, and then ideally we want to trade this bishop, because black would have weak, dark squares, we would trade it, and then black would have weak dark holes, and maybe we can exploit it, put, our queen or knight on like both dark squares, and yeah, with huge advantage. Or we can simply, trade on g6, right, h5, hg, trade this bishop at some point, right? Exchange it against his fianchetto bishop, get the queen through the h file, and checkmate him on h8. We need to exchange the g7 bishop because it guards the key h8 square. So if we can open up the h file, right, trade this bishop, get the queen through the h file, it's going to be checkmate on h8. So this is, I think, especially in a practical game, it's quite difficult to play this as black. So yeah, again, we see, you know, again and again how white plays simply autopilot normal moves, but does not really play the most aggressive moves. And that's again my point. You should always play the most aggressive move possible. But okay, so white castles, d5, alright. Yeah, d5 also makes sense, or d6 would have been another move. And then black can like play like knight b7, e5, or maybe bishop g4 first, pin the knight. There's also ideas like b5, b4, you know, attack on the queen side. So d6 would also be a typical move. But here, black chose d5 instead, alright. Let's see, e5, okay, makes sense. Knight e8. See, now the problem is that now after white has castled already, h4 may be still possible, but it is nowhere near as strong as it was before castling, right? Yeah, white should, plus now h4, black can play bishop g4, for example, h4, there's bishop g4, pinning the knight. Now we cannot attack the bishop with h3 and also stopping h5, you know, because black played d5, so now bishop g4 is available, versus if white played earlier, you know, e5, h4, the pawn was still on d7, so the bishop wasn't able to move through g4. Yeah, so because white castle, again, now h4 is not as strong as it would have been with rook on h1. But let's see, bishop f4. I don't really like this move. This shows that white does not apply prophylactic thinking, which is thinking what does your opponent want to do next. So we see that we have this nice pawn chain. So one thing that's clear is that black wants to undermine our essential pawn structure. So they want to go c5, maybe even f6 potentially, but especially c5, right? They want to undermine d4, which if they do, then e5 will become weaker. Also, another idea we have is bishop g4, pinning our knight, you know. So we need to apply prophylactic thinking. We should think, how can we prevent these ideas? To prevent bishop g4, we could play h3. The problem with that is that one is like a bit passive, and two, I think black can just like play c5 immediately, although it's not so clear. We could like just take, and after knight c6, rook e1, and then like bishop f4, queen e2, or queen d2. So I don't think it's so easy for black to get back this pawn, you know, so I think white is fine here. So maybe h3 is not that bad, right? It prevents bishop g4, and in case of c5, we just take. Another move would be something like knight e2, let's say. The point being that if black goes c5, we go c3 and reinforce our pawn structure. And now after cd, right, and we keep our nice pawn structure, one pawn defends another, you know, and if we play, let's say, bishop g4, we can just move our knight somewhere, I don't know, either back or through g3 or f4, and then play like h3. So that's also an option. But yeah, maybe h3 is like the easiest, you know, to prevent bishop g4. And then if black doesn't play c5, yeah, then just knight e2 and c3. Yeah, but let's see how white played. Bishop f4, yeah, this, you know, white plays neither knight e2, c3, nor h3 to prevent bishop g4, so white prevents none of those. Okay, a6, wow, complete waste of time. Black should have played either c5 or prepare c5 somehow, maybe, I don't know, queen b6, you know, I'm putting pressure here, or c5 immediately, like we have discussed earlier, or bishop g4, pinning the knight, right? An annoying pin. Why pin the knight? Because the knight guards the key d4 pawn, right? Plus the bishop is not so great, because it's kind of restricted by like his own pawns, right? If you look at black's pawn structure, so it's a bad bishop. It's also a quite close position. So in close positions, usually the knights are better than bishops, and so it makes sense to like get rid of this bishop and exchange it against a knight that one defends this key pawn, and two, you know, can potentially go through the weak black's dark squares, you know, so the knight is much better than the bishop. Yeah, so I think either c5 or bishop g4 would have been fine, but a6 is a absolute waste of time. All right, queen d2 makes sense. Like I said earlier, white want to trade the bishops because black has weak dark holes, right? So if we can trade it, you know, maybe get the queen to h6 ideally and get a knight through g5, that would be actually checkmate on g7. But even if not checkmate, suppose black plays e6 at some point later, you know, black simply has weak dark squares, and this bishop is a potential guardian of a weak dark squares. And so if we can trade it, then we'll eventually put our pieces, like for example our knights, and black won't have a guardian of those weak dark squares. But the problem again is, I mean, bishop g4. So I don't know, maybe h3 first would have been good, and then queen d2, bishop h6 should prevent bishop g4. And now black has this bad bishop which has no moves, right? So I think h3 would have been interesting. But alright, queen d2, knight d7, bishop g4 would have been interesting, threatening bishop f3. Maybe white could have simply moved the knight back, I don't know, and then like h3, and then bishop h6, and then the bishop goes back, and then knight goes back to f3. Maybe that could have happened. Still, I think bishop g4 is like way more active and way more challenging for white than knight bd7. But alright, let's see, bishop h6 makes sense. I'm just quickly looking at e6 if it makes any sense. You know, to destroy black's pawn structure, let's say fe, and then something like, I don't know, knight g5, and then like rook e1, pressuring e6. Also g6, h7 is weak. So for example, it might be something like, let's say, I don't know, knight g5, let's say, for example, knight b6, right, guarding the pawn, say rook h2 e1, attacking it again. You know, rook e5 doesn't work because of like bishop e5, attacking the rook with pressure. How else do they defend is not even clear. You know, knight c7, at the very least, of course, white could just take queen c7, knight e6, of course, at the very least, but white might also have some other ideas, like maybe h4, you know, and then like h5, and like g7 and h7 is super weak, the king is super weak. There might be some sacrifices potentially, oops, on h7, you know, or even g6, maybe, yeah, it's just huge compensation. So I think e6 would have been quite interesting, typical idea in this kind of positions, right? Especially because when there's no f7 pawn, g7 and h6 become very weak and prone to h4, h5 attack. But okay, white chose to continue with his original plan, which is also fine. Bishop h6, knight b6. Yeah, I mean, black's position is just super passive. Alright, takes. Knight takes. I'm not so sure about that. I think black should have taken with the king to prevent queen h6, right? To prevent queen h6. But knight g7 I think is a mistake. Knight e2. What about queen h6? And then knight g5, because knight e5 doesn't work. We just take, bishop takes, knight g5, checkmate. Right? So, whereas if they go bishop f5, we just don't take it. We play knight g5 immediately, and then queen h7, checkmate. So black would need to play something like f6, but that's also like kind of weakening g6, h7, and white can play like maybe like h4, h5, and then they cannot take us like take on h7. Well, maybe they can take with knight. I don't know. White can also like bring the knight to e2, f4, and attack again g6. Maybe like sacrifice on g6, take some and take, and like some checkmating ideas, right? Again, g6 is super weak. Yeah, so white here should have a huge advantage. So yeah, I think queen h6 was the correct move. Queen h6 and then to provoke f6, which is very weakening. But okay, white chose knight e2, knight c4, huh? All right. Queen c1, way too passive. Here's like another good lesson. Like your first instinct shouldn't be like, oh, to go back to defend some pawn. It should be, okay, let me sacrifice it. It doesn't matter, I want to checkmate my opponent, right? You should look at the most aggressive moves first. Moves that go forward. Moves that, you know, ignore some pawns and stuff. If you have like a, you know, there's a bigger mission, right? You want to like checkmate the king. So always look at the most aggressive moves first. Forward moves. Sacrifice. He has a threat. You should think, can I ignore his threat against my pawn? Like, defending the pawn should be the last thing you think about. It's way too passive. The queen, 9 points, guarding 1 pawn. That's like the last thing you should do. The queen should not, 9 points should not defend 1 pawn. I'd much rather sacrifice this pawn. Even if I have like maybe immediate checkmate, but I have a clear initiative, I'd much rather sack this pawn and have clear initiative than go queen c1 and have no initiative. Okay, so initiative comes first, material second. So queen c1 is a mistake. Should have played simply queen h6, and black does not even have a time to take the pawn because of knight g5 and then queen h7 checkmate. Let's say rook e8, I checkmate on h8. So play more aggressively. Don't defend some mere pawns, you know. Play more aggressively. So queen c1, huge mistake. Bishop f5. All right. Let's see. 91. Just look at white's last couple of moves. You know, move backward, move backward, move backward, and they just don't go queen h6, knight g5. It's crazy. Absolutely crazy. Yeah, 91. What is this? What is this? I mean, again, queen h6 would have been fine. Or even taking, maybe, I don't know, take my queen h6 but knight g5 maybe. Although I'm not so sure about this. Maybe not the best. But like queen h6, and then again black cannot take, because when we take, attack the knight, let's say takes, and the knight g5, checkmate. Right? Again, the same checkmate. So black doesn't even have time to take our bishop. So again, queen h6 was absolutely fine. No need for knight e1. Way too passive. Avoid making moves backwards. Alright? But yeah, let's see. Queen b6. Attacking our pawn, yeah? Again, we can just ignore it. White play what? b3. Well, again, white could have played queen h6 because black does not have time to take. Oh, wait. No. I'm sorry. Here already doesn't work. Because, like, as a custom, when the knight is on f3, there's always knight g5, but, like, now the knight is on e1. I forgot why I played knight e1. Yeah, now already queen h6 doesn't work. Yeah, now actually white has to play b3. Alright. Alright, let's see. b3, yeah. Okay. Knight a5. Yeah, not the best knight, of course. c3. Yeah, I guess c3 is okay. Another move would be maybe, I don't know, queen d2, pressuring the knight, you know, keeping an eye on the knight. Queen a3 also potentially interesting, right? Again, keeping an eye on the knight on a5, but also attacking the e7 pawn, right? The queen on c1 is very passive. So either this one or this one, I think, would have been quite good for white. But okay, let's see. He played c3, which again is on the more passive side. Takes. The knight is bad though. The knight on a5 is very bad. Plus, black also have weak dark squares. Has weak dark squares like c5. Knight f5, not a stable square. Knight g3. Okay, knight g3 is interesting. I was thinking about g4. Attacking the knight, and then like if the knight moves back, maybe like queen h6, and then now we need to get a knight to h5 somehow, although it's not so easy to do that. Another plan would be to play f4, rook f3, rook h3, rook lift, right? Get the rook to h3 and then checkmate again on h7 or h8. So g4 I think would have been also not bad. But again, knight g3 also makes sense. The key idea is to get rid of this knight on f5 because it guards the key h6 square. So knight g3 also makes sense. Alright, takes, hg. Hg. Okay, that's interesting. Now white can get the queen to h6, move the king to f2 and play rook h1 and attack on the h file. Another move would have been fg to open up the f rook. Also would have made sense. And then queen h6, oops, followed by rook f4, rook h4, right? And again, attack on the h file. Plus, white also has pressure on the f file. He can play after rook f4, rook h2, f1, pressure f7. There's also ideas like e6 potentially, you know, disrupting black's pawn structure, and then like knight e5. So I feel like fg also should have been massive advantage for white. Maybe even stronger. Yeah, probably even stronger, I guess, because again, white can combine different plans here. But alright, hg still should be advantage. e6, what is this? Black just further weakens his dark squares. Look at, he put all his pawns on the light square. That's crazy. Look at all his dark squares. I think black should play king g7 to prevent queen h6. None of these players apply prophylactic thinking whatsoever. None of them. That's crazy. So black should have played king g7 and then put a pawn not on e6, where it would further weaken the dark squares, but potentially f6, you know, to fight for some dark squares, right? On f6, to fight for some dark squares. Maybe even like rook h8, h5, maybe potentially h4, you know. Yeah, stuff like that. But we also need to solve this knight problem. It's quite difficult. Maybe queen c7, I don't know, b6, c5, right? And then like knight c6. I think that's the way. c7, queen c7, b6, c5. But yeah, king g7 was an absolute must. e6, very bad move. Rook e1, what is this? What is this rook e1? Complete waste of time. Queen h6 should have played. Queen h6, and then if we can somehow get the knight to g5, that'd be great. Maybe via e1, f3, g5, and then queen h7 checkmate. And I'm not sure black can even like prevent it easily. Or another plan would be after queen h6, like I said earlier, to play something like f3, king f2, rook h1. This is maybe even quicker, right? And then checkmate on the h file, right? So, but queen h6 was an absolute must. Rook e1, complete waste of a time. Why put the rook behind a pawn? The file is closed anyway. Makes no sense. Okay, king g7. Finally, black applies prophylactic thinking. Queen f4. White wants to go queen f6 checkmate. All right. Queen c7. I think black should play queen d8, of course, to prevent queen f6 check, right? And simply to bring the queen closer to the king, you know, and then maybe activate the knight somehow, you know, back. But okay, queen c7 again. Black simply allows queen f6. White does not play it. Yeah, okay, because queen f6, king g8, and then we can play queen d8. So I guess it's okay. Rook e3, rook lift, or maybe white wanna play g4, rook h3. That would make quite a bit of sense actually, right? But again, the way I showed, I think it was way more natural and quicker. But yeah, let's see, b6. Finally, black wants to bring his knight back into the game, but I think it's too late. I think black should have concentrated now more on the king side and prevented the immediate danger that's coming, you know. Yeah, g4, great move. Knight b7, rook h3. Okay, now queen h6 is inevitable. f5. Yeah, makes sense. Black needs to connect his queen to the 7th rank to defend the pawn. So f5, I mean. Let's see. ef. Wait a bit. We completely forgot about the queen. The queen is loose. Yeah, no, actually, yeah, black is just lost. So I think black actually should have played king g8. Yeah, king g8. First king g8, and after queen h6, then either f5 or f6. Yeah. Black is still much worse, but it's not like absolutely lost immediately, right? Play f5 or f6 and then bring the queen to g7, and black maybe can hold. Yeah, so king g8 was then the only move. Yeah, f6 actually. f5 actually loses, yeah, because the queen is loose. So this is, I guess, what, another lesson. Don't have loose pieces. Like, for example, here the queen is undefended. Loose means undefended. Don't have because you might think, oh, right now nobody attacks the queen, right? Because this queen is like blocked by the pawn, there's a pawn on e5, so why is it dangerous to have a loose piece? Yeah, but you never know. You might need at some point to play f6 or f5, you never know what may happen. Loose pieces tend to be lost. So don't have loose pieces. This is like one of the biggest lessons. Always make sure all your pieces are defended because they're prone to tactics. Loose pieces are prone to tactics. Okay, let's see, f5, ef en passant check. Rook f6, queen c7, check. White has won the queen, white is up a queen, and is absolutely winning. Rook h7 here, yeah. Another nice tactic, yeah, very nice. Rook h7, deflecting the king, takes, queen f7, check, king moves, and white can just take the knight, so black resigned. Okay, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.